Okay, welcome to this A-Level Edexcel Ethics Anthology 4, Michael Wilcockson, Euthanasia. And this is section 1 from the anthology. Let's read it, then we can analyse it. A good or bad medical practice. A third party in law refers to any agent other than the principal agent in the case of euthanasia. This would generally mean a doctor, sometimes also referred to as the physician. For all practical purposes, if euthanasia is to be justified at all, it has to be considered as part of medical practice. For it's reasonably clear that any other practice of euthanasia would be almost impossible to control or regulate. And then without regulation, society would permit killing or murder. Whatever moral code one adopts would be regarded as untenable. The consideration of euthanasia at present is rightly a medical issue. Put simply, it is this: should a doctor kill his patients in some circumstances? So let's think through this text. He says, a good or bad medical practice. I want to kind of begin straight out of the gates, challenging Wilcockson's neutrality here, his attempted neutrality on this issue. Here is he confusing moral and non-moral action. To give an example, if I had a rifle and shot someone, and you might say to me, that was a cracking shot. What a good shot that was, meaning I hit the target. It's a very different kind of statement from, that was a good shot. Maybe I stopped a terrorist or something. The word good here can be used in a moral and a non-moral sense. So what is good medical practice might be used in both senses of the word. And he really should be defining his word good here. So let's go on. And I want you to ask all the way through here, what's your view? What do you think about what's being said here? Let's look at this phrase here, a third party in law. And then he goes on, generally a doctor. Sometimes you could refer to the physician. And then for all practical purposes, euthanasia to be justified at all, it has to be considered part of medical practice. So does saying euthanasia has to come under the umbrella of medicine if it's to be legally justified? Well, what is he saying there? Does it really just add up to a kind of a priori, without evidence, assertion that we just need to adopt pro-choice as opposed to pro-life medical policy? He seems to be saying that, or at least he seems to be backing up when he says any other practice of euthanasia would be almost impossible to control or regulate. Well, that's interesting. I wonder what your view. Should euthanasia be controlled or regulated, or should it be banned? Are you pro-choice or pro-life in terms of what you think the legislation should be? Should doctors have the power to kill, to be pro-choice in a sense? Or do you think, no, they should not have the power to kill? So is this a significant ethical issue? What's your view? Most people think it's a really significant ethical issue, and one that takes up a lot of time by doctors and by judges and by people in Parliament. So it's in the news as we speak. But perhaps we need to name the myth being made here. Making myths can get you some popularity, as it were, in the academic world. And maybe Wilcockson here is kind of making a myth that needs to be named and therefore criticized. So what do we want to say about this? Well, pro-choice lobbyists frame the argument largely from a secular materialist assumption. Now, not all. There are some religious pro-choice supporters. We think of the liberal Christian Joseph Fletcher. He was a famous lobbyist for euthanasia, carried the banner in his books morals and medicine, while many atheists weren't. He was promoting it from the 50s and 60s. But generally today, the argument is made from not a religious perspective that God exists, but from an atheist perspective. And from the view that legalizing euthanasia is in the autonomous, that's a really important word we'll come back to, interests of the individual. This is the argument of Peter Singer and his preference utilitarianism. It's in the autonomous interests of those suffering. It's their suffering, it's their choice, it's pro-choice. If they're in a painful and especially terminal illness, then the questions can only rightly be framed as quality of life and rather than sanctity of life questions. But is it necessarily so? Pro-choice people would argue that this is to ignore how it all ends up, as might begin with autonomous choice, but ends up heteronomously affecting those in wider society who might feel the unintentional consequences of such legislation and what it might bring in the old and the vulnerable. And you'll see that in some of the discussion to come. So I wonder what your view is. While suicide has greatly been discussed throughout history, is it really true that merely modern medical advances have meant that there's more and more attention being turned in recent years towards euthanasia? Or is it just a political advance in general of kind of humanist ideology in terms of people who make policy in our country? What does it say here? Without regulation, society would permit murder, and whatever moral code one adopts, it would be regarded as untenable. And again, it's rightly a medical issue. You didn't get it the first time. Put simply as this: should a doctor kill his patients in some circumstances? Well, what's your view? This idea of regulating that he's said a couple of times now up at the top here, to regulate, to control or regulate. Can you regulate it or should you ban it? Do all moral codes add up to euthanasia? Well, that's kind of what he seems to say here. We're all going to arrive at some form of euthanasia, so why don't we legalize it? Well, is that not a simple, but a simplistic and perhaps disingenuous account of the issue? Take, for example, just one moral code, the Roman Catholic natural moral law theory. You'll have done this at the beginning of ethics. Very hard on that to arrive at least active, voluntary euthanasia. Yes, euthanasia is a medical ethics issue, and it's a medical issue. But again, we could do with defining the word medicine. What is medicine in the end anyway? Is it just the material kind of drugs and chemicals that we pump in bodies to help alleviate pain and treat particular things? Or are we more than mere material beings? I read recently about a surgeon who talked about forgiveness to his patients and saw remarkable changes. And this is only just to acknowledge the psychosomatic unity of the mind and the body. Well, what if we're not just a material thing? What if we're a transcendent thing? And this sort of non-transcendent assumption, this what Taylor calls buffered social imaginary, should be challenged. So that was section 1.